the Asexual Officer for LGBTQIA+ Young Fabians, and the outgoing National Coordinator for Young Fabians. Just to introduce the panel for this discussion now, and I can make opening statements if I want. Yasmin, you want to go first?
Introduce myself?
Yeah.
Well, hi everybody. My name is Yasmin Benoit. I'm a British model and award-winning asexual activist. I am a co-founder of International Asexuality Day on April 6th. I'm a board member of the Asexual Disability and Education Network and an asexualities research assistant at California State University, San Bernardino. And I created the This Is What Asexual Looks Like campaign.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Tina, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Owen. I'm Councillor Tina Bartois. I'm a Labour and Cooperative Party councillor on Hertfordshire County Council. I'm also chair of the East of England Young Fabians, and I'm the first openly asexual female politician in the country.
Thanks, Tina. Daniel?
Yep, my name is Daniel Walker. I use he, him pronouns that I can work out how to put on the screen because I've never used this piece of technology before. I am also an asexual activist. I identify as homoromantic asexual, and I run the SliceofAce YouTube channel.
Thanks, Daniel. So we're going to ask a few questions now, and if you want to submit a question, then there's usual Zoom process for doing so in the Q&A button at the bottom. So the first question I'm going to ask is, what policies do you think ACE people need? Tina, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. So I had a couple of ideas about this, and it is something that I've been talking about quite a bit recently. I think the really crucial things are to guarantee legal protection under UK law against acephobia. And I think we need to make sure that as the Labour Party and as Young Fabians submitting policy to the Labour Party, we need to be specifically addressing issues such as conversion therapy and corrective rape.
Daniel?
Yeah. So I definitely agree with all of that. I think I was looking up the Equality Act 2010 in preparation for this, and that it doesn't really give any explicit protection for asexual people. You would hope in most cases that they would be under the protected characteristic, but having those loopholes there is dangerous. And also, I think because there's such a lack of knowledge about asexuality, it's very easy for that discrimination and the acephobia to go under the radar. So I think improving visibility and then hopefully being able to have that officially in legal documentation will then help reduce some of that acephobia.
Thanks. Yasmin?
Yes, there's quite a few policy-related issues that impact the asexual community, definitely starting with the UK Equality Act 2010, which defines sexual orientation as being who you are attracted to as opposed to who you are not attracted to. So technically, by what they consider a sexual orientation, asexuality does not fall under it as a protected characteristic, which also connects to the hate crime laws as well. And that is something that I've actually been working on a project for the past year that specifically relates to trying to combat the discrimination towards asexual people in the workplace and institutions and in education. I can't specifically say what it is yet, but if anyone is curious and they think that they might be able to help, especially given some of your political connections, we're at the stage where we're due to launch it in early 2021, and we're just at like the funding part of the process at the moment. And also in terms of the pathologization of asexuality in the United States, a lot of work went into at least trying to get the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders to specify that asexuality, if you consider yourself as being asexual, then you should not be treated as if you have hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which is pretty much a medicalization of asexuality. But in the UK, under our International Classification of Diseases, the ICD does not have that same specification. And I do know of asexual people who have, they describe what is actually asexuality, but they are treated as though they have a disorder. And that connects to what Tina mentioned about the rates of conversion therapy for asexual people, which is actually quite high. So it definitely connects to that campaign. So there's a number of things that we need to tackle in that regard.
Is there anything, Tina or Daniel, you want to come back in that's been raised since you spoke? Or
I think just that point about education and how really vital that is. I was going to come to it later, but I think the way in which this has been taught. So I first came out as asexual earlier this year, and it was a massive deal for me because growing up I'd felt so different and wondered if I was weird or broken. It felt like I didn't have this thing that seemingly everyone else had, and at no point really as part of my education did I know that this was something that existed, and that needs to change.
Okay, so the next question I was planning to ask is, what can organisations do to be inclusive of asexual people? So like Young Fabians, but also organisations in general. Daniel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think the first step would obviously be informing people about what asexuality is and helping to dispel misconceptions and stereotypes of asexual people. I think corrective rape in the lens of asexuality can seem quite innocent and harmless to some people, and or conversion therapy. My brain was going to more conversion therapy because it might just be people who don't know about asexuality but who are genuinely concerned, because sex is such a big part of society. They may think that the person may be unhappy without sex and then try to recommend that they try it more, or they try it with a specific person, whereas obviously an asexual person doesn't necessarily need sex to be happy. So a lot of these issues arise from a lack of understanding of what asexuality is at a base level.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Yasmin?
Yeah, I think that regardless of what kind of organization it is, over something like the Young Fabians, or whether we're talking about like charities or businesses or corporations, I think that it's important to, first of all, ensure that most of them, hopefully they do have some kind of LGBTQ plus network within them that is also educated about asexuality and is inclusive in that regard. And I think that that should also hopefully tie in with their diversity and inclusion network. We should also hope is educated about asexuality. There are programs that exist relating to inclusive queer education within workplaces. So I'd hope that they're signed up to that, like Stonewall's one, for example. And I would hope that there's also a culture within those companies which fosters an appreciation for diversity and inclusion, and not just as like a buzzword that someone feels like they have to conform to. So I think it kind of connects to like a kind of wider culture within the organizations, and then specific actions and programs and education that you could do within those companies, not just in Pride Month or ACE Week, but throughout the year, which helps to normalize lesser known orientation so that their employees there and anyone they happen to end up working with don't end up feeling excluded in their workplaces.
Thanks. Tina?
Thank you. So as Daniel said, that recognition and awareness is really important. And then Yasmin touched on the idea of a safe space and a place to self-organize, which we're very lucky that we do have in this network. I think that organizations need to consider what their environments are like and what the likelihood of them being hypersexualized is quite high. And that's certainly an experience in politics that I've found. Organizations need to consider the impact of these environments and actively make a change with this. But then not just that, actively challenging acephobia and talking and learning more about it, so that there can be this shared knowledge, awareness, recognition, and just a space which is safe and friendly to us.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I work in engineering, which is obviously a very heavily male-dominated field, and men, I think, in society are kind of conditioned to be more open about their sexuality, which can make it feel less welcoming for someone who is asexual. I think that would be something that maybe needs to be tackled on a depending on which field you're in.
Is Owen still here?
Don't know.
They're a secondary host.
If you wanted me to ramble a bit longer, I was also thinking that in conversations about asexuality and talking about asexuality and educating people about asexuality in organizations, I think it's important to put ace voices themselves forefront in that conversation, just because it's one thing to inform someone about asexuality on a I guess data-based level, and just saying explicitly what asexuality is. But I think it's much more important and much more impactful if you hear the experience of someone who themselves identifies as asexual.
Thanks, Daniel. The next question I was going to ask is about relationship between romantic and sexual orientations in general and for you specifically. Yasmin, do you want to go first on this?
Yeah, well, I'm asexual and aromantic, which means that I don't experience sexual attraction. I don't experience romantic attraction. There's definitely an overlap in the aromantic and asexual community. Those are quite closely entwined communities historically, but there is a distinct difference between the two. There are lots of people that are aromantic and not asexual, so they still experience sexual attraction. They still experience romantic attraction. And there are lots of people, like Daniel, for example, who is asexual but still experiences romantic attraction. And I think that in our culture, we're kind of taught that that your romantic orientation, your sexual orientation is usually perfectly entwined. And for a lot of people, they are directly entwined, but it's not just the asexual community that takes into consideration that your romantic and sexual attraction don't always go the same way. I hear the bisexual community and the pansexual community also talk a lot about what we call the split attraction model, which kind of differentiates between sexual and romantic attraction. But for me and my personal experience, they did kind of blend together for a long time, because of course, growing up, you can't always tell like what is is this a manifestation of a lack of romantic attraction or sexual attraction? Is what people are expressing right now sexual attraction, or is it romantic attraction, especially if you're at an age where people aren't actually having sex very much? But as an adult, having encountered a lot more of the asexual community, I became a lot more well-versed in like the distinction between the two experiences and how separate they can be. So yeah, it's a unique experience depending on how your sexual orientation, your romantic orientation line up.
Thanks, Yasmin. Tina, do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Yasmin gave a really good and clear explanation there of how these things link together. What I think I want to contribute is I'm much clearer about how I feel about the sexual side of things, and I'm a bit less clear on the romantic side of things. And I think that in itself, in addition to it being quite confusing because of how society sees them as being perfectly aligned, that again can be quite confusing, trying to work out where you fit within the ACE community. But I think that labels can be quite useful to actually find your community, and that's been really helpful to me. But I don't really feel any pressure to work out the romantic side of stuff. I think that that's very much societal as well, because of the massive kind of hypersexualization in society, but also because of intersectionality, which I know you're coming on to. So I will end it there.
Okay. Daniel?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that Yasmin already gave a very comprehensive overview of the spur attraction model, and I think that to add on to that, I think the language that we use in the spur attraction model and having the flexibility, if you need it, if it helps you express your identity, to split those attraction into different forms, could be useful even outside of the ACE community, just because there are some people who may be biromantic and heterosexual, but they might just think they're bi and not really understand why they're not feeling the same way about both genders sexually. So I think it's even though we use it predominantly in the ACE community, I think it would be very useful to then expand that language and share that language with other people, so then they could understand themselves better if they need that language to express their identity. But I guess on a more personal note, as I mentioned earlier, I identify as homoromantic asexual, so I feel romantic attraction to other men, but sexual attraction to no one. And I'm currently dating a guy who doesn't identify as asexual. So I guess they're very distinct for me, whereas I understand for someone like Yasmin, where they don't feel romantic or sexual attraction, it may be that there isn't necessarily that distinction between them. But they're very different parts of my identity, and I kind of straddle the line between the gay and the ace community, although because the gay male community is so hypersexual at times, I tend to fit more within the ace community.
Is there anything else anyone wants to add before we move to the next question? Okay, so next question I've got planned is how can asexual activism be intersectional? Tina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So asexual identities, as we've heard so far, are complex, and the experiences of asexual people vary greatly due to intersectional factors. So as I said earlier, hypersexualization has affected my experience in a significant way, because I'm young and a woman and of Asian descent, and those are the kinds of elements that need to be considered holistically when you're looking at activism, because those experiences, whilst there's a lot that's shared, there's a lot that's also different.
Daniel, is there anything else?
What Tina hinted at there, the ACE community is really broad. If you look at other LGBT plus communities, they tend to be focused on one specific part. Like even the gay and the lesbian community are somewhat separate. Whereas if you look at the entirety of the ACE community, you've got different romantic and sexual orientations. You've got people on different parts of the ACE spectrum, people identified as demisexual, for example. So already there, you've got such a plethora of experiences that is difficult to represent everything in one go. And that's before you even consider intersectional identities, which fall outside of the, I guess, ACE experience. So things like, I'm sure Yasmin will mention in a moment, how race intersects and affects your experience of asexuality, or religion, or your gender identity. There's so many ways in which other parts of your identity may intersect and affect your experience and how you express your asexuality and what your asexuality means to you, depending on the culture you grew up in, the society around you, and how people react to the fact that you're asexual.
Thanks, Daniel. Yasmin?
Yeah, I think that you should always aim to make your activism intersectional, especially if we're talking about asexuality, because it is a very broad community. And for example, disability plays a big role in the asexual community. I think 1 in 6 asexual people is autistic. And there's also a very high representation of non-binary and trans asexual people. So when you're discussing asexuality, it is important to keep those intersections in mind. At the same time, if you fail to kind of pay a lot of attention to way different intersections play a role, whether it's disability, whether it's race, whether it's gender, then you also are more likely to fall into a pre-existing trap that we have had in the asexual community of only representing it in a very specific way. A lot of asexual representation in the way asexuality is depicted and portrayed and explained is centered around a white asexual experience, predominantly represented by either very young white asexual women or kind of slightly older white asexual men, in terms of who the community tends to amplify and also who the media tends to prefer to discuss these kind of conversations. So I think it's definitely important to keep things intersectional, because while there's a higher percentage of white people that are more comfortable using the label asexual, there are lots of asexual people who aren't white. And I can say that in my experience, my Blackness heavily intersects with the way I've been perceived as an asexual person. It influences the opportunities I get. It influences the way people react to me inside the asexual community and outside the asexual community. And the politics around Black sexuality and womanhood and how that intersects with the way you're supposed to experience sexuality and masculinity and all these factors play a really big role. So I think in anything you're trying to do, you should definitely try and keep as many intersections in mind as possible.
Thanks, Yasmin. Anyone got anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think I was talking to someone, a PhD researcher the other day, who researches this sort of intersectionality, and they found that in spaces that try to avoid conversations about race in an effort to be neutral, it ends up being an implicitly white space, and then Black voices then get suppressed, and people of color can't then talk about what they want to talk about in how their asexuality intersects with race. And on top of that, another thing we spoke about was how gender intersects with asexuality. And that in one study, they found that, if I remember the statistics correctly, 60% of the respondents were identified as female, 30% were non-binary, and 10% identified as male. Now, if you compare that to a representation of the entire populace, I suppose, it's very strange to see that there are 3 times the amount of non-binary people to male identified people. Now, I'm not entirely sure why that is. It could be that society expects men to be more sexual, and therefore it's more difficult for them to then come out or come to terms with their asexuality. And that may then, just hypothesizing, tie into what Yasmin was saying about what the media prefers to show in ace people. So women in general are expected to be non-sexual. Their sexuality is supposed to be passive in a way. So that might be palatable that a woman is asexual, a white woman is asexual. And older men as well, when you're older, it's generally expected that you are less sexual. So that, in my mind, kind of lines up. So there's definitely a lot of important topics to talk about in terms of intersectionality within the ace community.
Yeah. Anything else anyone wants to add now? Okay, so the next question I planned is, what resources have you found useful for asexuality that you'd recommend other people take a look at if they want to find out more? I guess both from both people who are asexual, I think they might be, or people who want to be better allies. Daniel, do you want to go first?
Yes, although I did just speak a lot, so I'll try to keep this relatively brief. So I'd recommend that you follow Yasmin's work for one. She does amazing activism work, especially during Ace Week. I don't know how you fit so many things in 1 week. And there are other activists and Ace voices you can listen to, like the Sounds Fake But Okay podcast. The AOK podcast isn't running anymore, but it still has a large library of Ace voices because they interviewed someone from the Ace community every week. Cody Dagan Orions Ace Dad Advice is a big Ace activist and content creator on YouTube and TikTok. And then one other thing I did want to quickly shout out was Ace Owl on Twitter, or at Asexual Research. They have a very large library of asexual research into things like how aces experience mental health or harassment, or how asexuality is treated in the workplace. So it's definitely worth a look at that sort of thing.
Thanks. Yasmin?
Yeah, I think I'll lean, as Daniel covered last social media ones, I think I'll lean towards more the kind of resources in the sense of asexual research is definitely one I'd recommend. Asexuality.org, which is the Asexual Visibility Education Network's website, has a lot of like links and resources over there, and answers a lot of the common questions that people have about asexuality. Asexual outreach play a big role in actually putting on Ace Week. They also have a lot of resources, as does aceweek.org. In terms of if you were more of a reader, Angela Chen did a book, I think it came out last year, called Ace, that covers a lot of asexual experiences in there. Julia Decker, who wrote The Invisible Orientation, which is a pretty well-known book in the community, that also answers a lot of questions about asexuality in a slightly more academic way if you're into that kind of thing. Yeah, I think those are the ones that I would mention off the top of my head.
Thanks. Tina?
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot that's been covered there, and that's kind of what I was saying in terms of actually finding out and then having that label, so you're able to access these things. Personally, as Yasmin's mentioned, the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, but I was going to say a lot of for me, I just spent a lot of time on YouTube, on a lot of very different channels, and shout out to Daniel's channel, which I actually did watch in that process, SliceofAce. And I think speaking to people, actually speaking to people around you and hearing directly, and I think events like this, that's how I found out more in the first place. So kind of just talking and keeping that forum going.
Thanks. Any follow-ups? Anyone wants to make on that?
Actually, I did have one more for thinking about YouTube. A lot of the conferences that go on are also live streamed, and those videos are actually saved onto YouTube. I believe there's a Pan-Asian ACE conference that's pretty big that's going on right now. I believe a lot of those videos and those panels that relate to a range of different topics about asexuality end up on YouTube. The International ACE conference, which happened last year, that had a really big amount of involvement. Those are still on YouTube, and a lot of asexual conferences in the UK and elsewhere are also on there. So if you specifically type them in, then you could find pretty much a whole bunch of these kinds of panels covering a range of different topics.
Thanks. That's a great point. Anything anyone else wants to say on that? Okay. Then the final question I presented was kind of just how in general do you talk to people about asexuality? Does it on an everyday basis, like, does it come up? How do you come out to people, I guess, in a sense as well? Tina, do you want to go first?
Absolutely. I think in terms of talking to people, so when I essentially brought the topic up with my friends, and I was like, look, I think this is how I identify. I've been looking at these bits and pieces, as I said, and having these sorts of conversations. And I found that really empowering, because not only were they so supportive, but it actually gave a space and created a forum, as I was saying earlier, where we were sharing our experiences. And I think everybody learned a lot, and having that safe space at that particular stage of my journey was a really, really big deal. In terms of kind of, does it come up? I'd say it does, for a whole host of different reasons, really. It's something that I talk about a lot with my boyfriend, who also identifies as ace, and I think that relationship there is really, really supportive because of that. And I think it's about being really open about what your asexuality means, and how it interacts with your identity, how it interacts with those relationships that you do or don't form. And of course it comes up because there aren't very many openly asexual politicians out there, which is something that I'm really concerned about. So I think that talking about it, and I did feel less comfortable sharing that I'm asexual than I did about sharing my bisexuality. And I think really challenging why that is. It's difficult to put yourself out there when you're the first or one of the first, but I think talking about it really gives other people a better chance at that experience.
Thanks. Yasmin, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably have a kind of unique experience in the sense that it's really not a secret for me. Like, most people who encounter me kind of already familiar with what I do and what my work is about. So it isn't really, so sometimes it feels like that's kind of all I end up talking about, even in my interpersonal life. But in terms of kind of encountering new people or kind of speaking to different audiences through my work, one of the main things that I try and emphasize in my approach is just trying to humanize it to the audience, because people already, even though most people don't know what asexuality is, they still have a lot of misconceptions about it, which tend to just come from the way we're taught to understand sexuality in our society and the stereotypes that we attach to people who experience it in various different ways, including in a more asexual way. So I just try and hopefully make it seem relatable and something that is a perspective that's actually very beneficial to everyone to keep in mind, like the different ways that sexuality can manifest in different people. That's personally my approach.
Thanks, Yasmin. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. I think I find it interesting what Tina was saying about finding it easier to openly talk about bisexuality than asexuality, because I guess on a day-to-day basis, I tend to present as gay because I don't really bring up my asexuality if I don't have to, but my boyfriend will come up in conversation every now and then because I talk to him every day, so he's bound to. So I guess from an outside perspective, I tend to look gay as any other person who may identify as homosexual and isn't on the A spectrum would do. But then I think it is then important to, I try when I can to bring up asexuality, because I know that it's not something that a lot of people know about. But I think, I guess from the other perspective, if someone were to come out as asexual to you or talk about their asexuality, it's important to respect what they're saying. And even if you don't understand what they're saying at the time, don't try and interrogate them about their orientation, because coming out is a very difficult experience as is. And I think it can very easily stray into questions which aren't appropriate to ask anyone. But for some reason, I guess because of the way that society ingrains sexuality in us, it's seen that these inappropriate questions are suddenly appropriate to ask if you come out as asexual.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Is there anything else anyone wants to add on that one? Okay, I guess we'll now go on to the questions we've had submitted from the audience. We've had 2 so far, both from Ollie Smith. If anyone else wants to submit one, that'd be great. The first one we asked is about media representation. How important do you think it is, and do you have any examples of media that have done it well? So Yasmin, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that media representation is important when it comes to just normalizing asexuality and portraying asexual narratives and representing asexual experiences. It is something that we are extremely lacking in. And again, when we do tend to get it, it does tend to fall into some pretty common tropes. I think if you're white and asexual, you'll have a lot better time at trying to find representation in media that's a lot like you, whereas Black asexual representation is incredibly scarce. And then you kind of have the asexual characters that kind of seem asexual, or they kind of are sort of depicted as being somewhat asexual, but it's usually tied into a sort of lack of empathy or like a kind of socializing problem or a personality flaw that needs to be resolved by the end of the plot line. But I think there has been a very small handful of places of media examples that have kind of done it justice, and the most obvious example is probably Todd in BoJack Horseman, because that's one of the few where he was actually a fully fledged character and they consulted asexual people. Particularly, I think it was an asexual group in California about how to represent that character. The rest of them have kind of just been a small handful. So I feel like that's probably one of the more grown examples. But again, that's still white male asexual representation. So it's still not, entirely representative, and it's just gender representation. So it's not hugely representative of a lot of the community, but that is probably one of the better examples I can think of.
Thanks. Tina, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think that in terms of kind of media representation, I think that media representation and just representation as a whole is always really important. Whether or not it in itself changes anything, I think all of us can appreciate that seeing people who look like us and have similar identities mean that we feel like we can do certain things too. And there, I think there's a massive gap all round in terms of asexual people in the media, but particularly any people of colour. And that's something that I really struggle with. I want to touch on something Yasmin said about kind of characters being depicted as asexual. I feel like when that happens, it's really treated like something's wrong with this person and it's going to be fixed, or it's never kind of overtly said, and there's a lot of jokes at the expense of that person, which is really unhelpful and completely unacceptable. So yeah, in terms of kind of positive media examples, I'm not really sure how to answer that one, but we have definitely got two other panelists here who I think might have some of that covered.
Thanks, Tina. Daniel?
Yeah, so I think both Yasmin and Tina have been very comprehensive, which is saying a lot about the representation of asexual people in the media, in that it's not very comprehensive. It's half because the ace community is so broad, so we do need a lot of representation in order to represent the majority or the entirety of the community, but also because at the moment people are so unwilling to show asexual characters, and especially asexual characters who are also well-rounded as a character, and they're also asexual, because I feel like the trap that a lot of people fall in is that when they want to add a queer character, they will just add a queer character for the sake of them being a queer character, and the character has no characterization outside of their queerness. That was a tongue twister. But I'd like Yasmin said, Todd from BoJack Horseman remains the gold standard, and I guess he's really the only character from a long-running series who was a well-rounded character and was asexual, and asexual people were consulted. And it's been a while since BoJack Horseman finished, and there still hasn't been much progress in the area. There has been a little bits and bobs. So there was a side character in the second season of Sex Education who was Florence, who had like a third of an episode worth of a very neat ace coming out story, and is shockingly, well, I suppose it's not particularly shocking that they're completely absent from the third season of the series, because whoever was making the show obviously ticked their box for asexual representation and doesn't look back at it. Whereas there are obviously a lot more ace stories to tell. It's just people aren't willing to do that at the moment, and we need to keep pushing until we do get that proper representation and a wide variety of it, so we can cover all experiences.
Is there anything else anyone wants to add? No? Okay. So the other question I submitted was saying that in Young Fabians this year we've talked a lot about queer health. What barriers do ace people face in accessing decent healthcare, both mental health, which you have touched on, and physical and sexual health? So Tina, do you want to go first on that?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of different things that I've just noted down. I'm going to start kind of with the mental health aspect of that. And I think the biggest thing I faced, especially talking about it prior to coming out, there were a few people who were completely and utterly not supportive at all. And I was faced with this sort of idea that it's a phase. Are you sure? Maybe you just haven't found the right person. I think that actually from that point, like when you get into a relationship, it's just assumed that like there's this thing that's cured and it's not a thing anymore. And the mental health impact of that is immense. In terms of accessing healthcare, so an experience I've had before as a woman is that so you kind of, I was having an issue, and then basically I was asked to, and they do this all the time with women. It was because I had a partner at the time, it was assumed that I must be having sex. So then I had to take this whole pregnancy test thing before then, like coming back around to actually going to hospital to then be treated. And it was an agony the whole time. And I think there's this real assumption around, you know, people are having sex, how much sex you're having, all of those things. And it's not just the ace community that's impacting, because there are loads of studies saying that younger people on the whole are having less sex. I think there's a lot to be said about competent care that actually addresses like who a person is. We're never going to get there with ACE healthcare if there's still a fear of disclosing. Because you feel like you might be pathologized, you might be, you know, they might say this is a problem, and then you're being judged, you're not getting the care or the treatment that everybody should be entitled to. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks. Daniel, want to go next?
So I remember one experience where I was at the GP, and some sexual health issues came up, and I basically said to her, "It's fine. I'm not going to have sex, so it's not a problem." And the look of derision they gave me was astounding. And if a medical professional isn't going to respect my identity, then it's difficult to then get care which is affirmative of that identity. And I think it can cause a lot of people to be unwilling to access the medical health care or the mental health care that they might need if the person giving that care isn't respecting the way you identify.
Thanks, Daniel. Yasmin?
Yeah, I mean, building on what both Daniel and Tina said, I think in terms of physical health, when I was conducting the research as part of the project I'm doing and getting a lot of case studies, a lot of people raised issues that they had had in healthcare, visiting GPs, lots of women specified in terms of smear tests, in terms of like cervical health, sexual health, being asked inappropriate questions, them not having the resources for it. So I definitely think that is quite a common pattern that I've heard that impacts asexual people. And I think that when it comes to mental health, based on some of the research that's out there, and speaking of resources, I would definitely recommend checking out the ACE census, formerly known as the Asexual Community Survey, because there's a lot of information there. That's quite a widely done survey, and that's often revealed that issues like depression and anxiety are particularly high in asexual people, and it can be particularly harder to get help for that kind of thing because of the pathologization of asexuality and the inclination of people in the mental health sector to believe that your asexuality is the cause of your problems. As an experience I almost had, and I was just in university visiting like the school counselor because of exam stress, and as soon as I mentioned that I was asexual, they were like, okay, well obviously that's why you're really here, like that's the issue we're here to resolve. And I was like, no, it was actually just because of the upcoming exam. Like that was not a problem. But I do wonder what might have happened if I wasn't already in that place mentally, and if I hadn't already known about asexuality, then maybe we could have ended up going down a pretty harmful route in trying to fix the mental problem that is asexuality, according to them. So I think that those issues are particularly important, and it is important to make sure that those people in those sectors are well versed in it, including sexologists. I've also had a lot of conversation with sexologists, because that can also be heavily about, you need to be having this type of sex this often. The whole point is to get people to have more positive sex. And so if you approach a sexologist or someone in that area describing asexuality to them, there's also common inclination to try and fix that and make you have sex or experience sexuality in a specific way. So there's quite a few ways that can be an impact.
Thanks, Yasmin. Is there anything else anyone wants to come back to?
I guess just to add on to that, oh God, I think it's completely left my brain. Maybe it'll come back later. That was sudden.
It happens.
Yeah. Okay, so we don't have any more audience questions unless someone's going to submit one right now. So I think kind of time to be drawing this towards a close. So kind of is general closing statement, but also do you want to talk about how people can be good ASLIs as individuals? Daniel, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, so I guess try to educate yourself about asexuality in the ace community, every part of it, so that if you do encounter someone who is asexual, you can say, "Ah, yes, I understand this," and then you can validate their asexuality and respect it a lot better than if you didn't understand it at all, and you might intentionally or otherwise fall into the common misconceptions around asexuality. So I think a really good first step is listening to ace people and their experiences, so you can understand them, so you can understand what ace people go through and the kind of problems that ace people may face that you may be completely oblivious to.
Thanks. Yasmin?
I would say that I think it's helpful to unpack your own understanding of sexuality to yourself, because often one of the things that impacts asexual people is this idea that, feeling sexual attraction, having that kind of intrinsic desire to have sex with other people, you're having an oriented sexuality is something that is fundamental to the human experience and is fundamental to your happiness and being able to live a proper life. And I think that kind of mentality isn't just harmful to asexual people. I think it's harmful to everyone, but all of that emphasis on sex and how you have it. And I think that if we could all work on unpacking where that comes from and questioning how essential it really is to have a non-asexual experience of sexuality, then that will in turn help people to kind of not approach asexual people with all those misconceptions and all those stereotypes and all those negative associations that people have when they hear about asexuality.
Thanks, Yasmin. Tina?
Yeah, I think that the point about not making assumptions is really important, but also remembering the different aspects of someone's identity. So the intersectionality we've been talking about, even within the LGBT plus community itself. And I think within the young Fabians, this is exactly the kind of visibility that ace people need. And listening to our voices on the issues that are impacting us, like we've mentioned, healthcare, education, the Equality Act, and platforming, raising those voices as part of that discussion and hopefully creating policy change in the process.
Thanks. Unless there's anything else anyone wants to add, I think that's it. Then thanks everyone for coming, and in particular thanks to Yasmin, Tina and Daniel for agreeing to speak to us today. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks very much.